So hello to everyone. I'm delighted and honored to introduce Professor Paul Bandia on behalf of TRACT, our research team in translation studies within the PRISM research unit. Paul is Professor of Translation Studies in the Department of French at Concordia University in Montreal. He taught at the University of Montreal for several years, as well as the University of the Antilles and Guyana in Martinique. Paul is also a senior fellow at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He is also currently a member of the Executive Council of the International Association for Translation and Intercultural Studies, IATIS, and president of the Association for Translation Studies in Africa. Paul is a specialist of postcolonial translation and history, is particularly interested in Africa and its diaspora, whose cultures and literatures constitute an area of study most suitable for the development of a theory and practice of translation beyond Eurocentric and normative models. Paul has given many lectures and keynote addresses, primarily in English, but also in French at conferences in America, Europe, and Africa, and has published extensively in the fields of translation studies and postcolonial literatures and cultures. He has been a regular contributor to two of the most renowned translation studies journals, TTR, Traduction, Terminologie, Rédaction, and Meta Translators Journal, as well as the Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, edited by Mona Baker. He has written, edited, or co-edited several books dealing with major topics and changes in the field of translation studies, and notably in a postcolonial context. His most recent work, Orality and Translation, which was published in 2017, raises a number of the questions he will examine in this conference. Finally, I would like to seize this opportunity to thank and congratulate the organizing team for this conference, Juliette Bezer, Tiffany Levick, and Celestine Danel, for setting up this event under changing and difficult circumstances. And when I look at the program, I'm sure we're in for a terrific and thought-provoking conference. Dear Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you for that very interesting and very elaborate presentation. I'm so flattered. I'm so happy to be involved in this project. I think it's just a wonderful project. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this project, this conference, I would say, who have put in a lot of effort, and especially because they did not give up moving from what you would call the in-person format to the online format. I'm so glad that you stuck to the guns and decided that you're going to continue with this. And it is, to me, a great pleasure to be part of this. This is a topic that requires a lot of attention, given the current experiences we're having across the globe. And in my estimation, it is timely indeed to be able to do this. I also like to take the opportunity to congratulate Tiffany for her new position. It is always a good thing to see how translation studies is being appreciated across the globe by such appointments in different departments across universities in the world. It is not an easy thing to get positions like that related to translation studies and English studies, I suppose. I know because I was once appointed to Université, what was it, Lumière 2, and I decided to stay in Canada and stay in the cold, which is kind of interesting. All right. Anyway, so my talk today, I would just want to start by, because we don't have a lot of time, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to share the screen again, if you don't mind. See? All right. Can you see it?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to share the screen, and I'm just going to talk to you about how I perceive this conference and the objectives of this conference, but it's such a broad topic that you cannot necessarily cover all the ground. So what I'm doing, I'm coming to it from a more of a historical perspective. I'm trying to locate the significance of the concept of linguistic minorities as a basis for exploring research in translation studies, and the impact of such conceptualization on the evolution of thinking in the field of translation studies. It also calls attention to how linguistic minorities have reshaped translation discourse from a mainly Eurocentric approach to a more diverse and inclusive, what I would refer to as postmodernist understanding of translation studies. Over the last several decades, we have witnessed an unparalleled movement or displacement of peoples, as well as a shifting of geographical boundaries across the globe. Large-scale migration and rampant globalization have enhanced linguistic and cultural encounters at a much greater scale between and among societies with remote historical relations, resulting in a postmodern Babel, as I would call it, thus locating translation at the very center of human activity and existence. This global encounter of languages and cultures gives rise to a multiplicity of derived or variational manifestations of linguistic and cultural habitus in a context marked by competitivity and unequal power relations. But before globalization, there was imperialism, and the evocation of linguistic minorities through the prism of Anglophone and Francophone spheres, as evidenced in the title of this conference, speaks to the unavoidable consequences of imperialism and colonization in determining what is meant by the concept of linguistic minorities in contemporary scholarly discourse. There are, of course, linguistic minorities not tethered to Western imperial epithets, such as Anglophone or Francophone. For instance, there are linguistic minorities within the ecology of non-Western power, such as China or Russia. However, a main constant that holds for all claims of linguistic minorities is the power asymmetry implied in the relations between such groups and the dominant or imperial power. This is even more so in the context of Western imperial impositions on language cultures in the global South and in cultural communities at the basis of the ethno-cosmopolitanism in the global North. I just want to scroll down. Let's see. How do you scroll down with this?
You should just be able to touch your screen and just go to the next slide.
Okay.
You just click.
Okay. See this?
We'll press an arrow button. Is there an arrow button that you can press to go to the next? Yeah.
Good. I just did. That's right. This is what it is. That's right. All right. I'm not sure if that is the right one. Let's see. Yeah, this is the right one. Very good. It was kind of inactive for a while. Anyways, so regarding the linguistic minorities in the Anglophone and Francophone spheres, the main concerns of this conference, it is important to trace the historical pathways of the phenomenon in order to be able to ascertain its significance for translation theory and practice. The notion of an Anglophone and a Francophone sphere evokes the historical longue durée of Western imperialism and colonization, which has come to define the power differentials between imperial languages and the colonized language cultures. The fate or outcome for linguistic minorities depended very much on the model of empire implemented in this relationship of intimate enemies between the colonizer and the colonized. Hence, the palpable difference in the experience of linguistic minorities in the Anglophone and Francophone spheres. British colonization is said to have favored what historians refer to as indirect rule, while colonization by France had adopted a policy of assimilation. By virtue of this difference in colonial governmentality, relations between the colonial language and indigenous languages evolved differently. It has been pointed out that in the Anglophone sphere, linguistic minorities had felt no compunction about taking liberties with their use of the colonial language, fashioning it to align with the rich artistry and aesthetics afforded by the oral narratives and tradition. This often involved a fair measure of localization or nativization of the colonial language, a process by which the transplanted and imposed colonial language becomes native to the colonized. In this regard, the eminent Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe is often cited as a stalwart in laying claim to the English language and assuming the right to bend or ply the language to reflect African sensibilities. There is therefore a plethora of linguistic minority practices in the Anglophone world, in Africa, Asia, including the settlement colonies in North America and Oceania. These English-based linguistic variants can also be found across Europe and even within Britain itself. In the sphere, or in the Francophone sphere, where colonial governmentality had adopted the politique assimilatrice, policy of assimilation, described crudely as a desire to turn the colonized into French subjects in a civilizing mission, linguistic minority practices were somewhat stifled by the policing of the French language, such by groups such as the Académie Française, and the ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité, which again sought to elevate the colonized into proper French citizenry. The consequence was that during colonization, linguistic minorities or the colonized engaged timidly with the Africanization of French, at least compared to their Anglophone counterparts. Renowned poets and writers of the Negritude movement, such as Senghor and Aimé Césaire, extolled the virtues of the French language and sought to express their Africanity in a language and style that rivaled those of the hexagonal poets. Highly successful, their language conveyed the essence of Africanity without necessarily establishing itself as a minority or derivative of a version of French. In fact, it was still too early to speak about an African French language at the time when Anglophone writing was already establishing itself in terms of an African variety of English as was common across the British Commonwealth of Nations. The Negritude writers did not constitute a linguistic minority as such, but were ethnocultural pioneers who began to lay the groundwork for asserting African identity within the Francophone realm. Postcolonialism and cultural studies have had a significant impact on the evolution of translation studies, particularly within the framework of a cultural turn in the field. The cultural turn, it seems, had unshackled the many and diverse linguistic minorities whose voices were muffled within translation scholarship, either because the imperial or global languages were construed as alien to them, or because their interests, whether political, cultural, or social, do not always fit into the straitjacket mainstream traditional translation discourse. In fact, in some ways, their interests were sidelined, perhaps because they clashed with the preoccupations of a mainly Eurocentric perspective. The entire enterprise of writing back at the imperial power, which dates back to Chinua Achebe's seminal 1958 novel, Things Fall Apart, and later Salman Rushdie's 1982 article, The Empire Writes Back with a Vengeance, determines the intersection between postcolonialism and translation studies. As I have argued elsewhere, postcolonial writing in European languages is akin to translation, whereby the linguistic minority seeks to appropriate a global language for the benefit of the community's specific literary emancipation. Later in 1989, the concept of writing back was synthesized in a nonfiction volume entitled The Empire Writes Back, Theory and Practice in Postcolonial Literature. Its contemporary conceptual weaponry derives from the notion that postcolonial intercultural writing is akin to translation, as the minority writer is engaged in an act of representation of self by means of a global language in order to access the global literary space. The idea of linguistic minorities within the Anglophone and Francophone spheres can be traced back to European language writing practiced in the pre- and post-independence period, when colonized peoples began to express their history and literary culture in the colonial languages in order to reach a wider audience. Having successfully combated colonialism and achieved independence, European language writers had now embarked on another phase of the struggle for literary and cultural assertion and recognition, thus asserting their identity as distinct from colonial impositions and narratives. English and French were now being used as a medium for conveying the literary and cultural essence of colonial or colonized societies, albeit in a language that can be recognized as emanating yet distinct from the imperial language. The fashioning of post-colonial varieties of English or French is at the very root of the becoming of linguistic minorities within the historical reality of the Francophonie and the Anglophonie. We must not overlook the related evolution of this phenomenon in the context of slavery, whereby the longue durée of history has even given rise to the creation of viable Creole languages, of literary and cultural significance within their own native speakers. These post-colonial varieties of English or French, as well as the languages of creolization, can reveal some of the ways in which minority communities have influenced reflection in the field of translation studies. While postcolonial writing by its very nature evokes translation, the transmission of this kind of writing anticipates specific considerations for translation theory and practice. In other words, the translation of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's The River Between, or Amadou Kourouma's The Soleil des Indépendances, or Patrick Chamoiseau's Texaco, encourages translation thinking that will account for the cultural specificity and postcoloniality of the text in a process akin to transculturality, rather than a mere linguistic transfer. Outside translation studies proper, there is hardly any evocation of postcoloniality without allusion to translation as a phenomenon, whether concretely or metaphorically. Discourses on postcolonialism and related issues of pluralism and diversity are often couched in terms related to translation. The interaction between language cultures and the carrying across between languages of unequal power relations, as is the case between the languages of the metropole and the post-colony, are fundamentally issues related to what can be referred to as translation as representation. Translation thus participates in post-colonial discourse insofar as the main tenets are about relations between the center and the periphery, or the marginalized, the local and the global, or what Venuti has referred to as majoritizing versus minoritizing cultures. Translation, the theory, has had to reckon with the predominance of multilingual practices in the larger proportion of human society. Postcolonial multilinguality has laid bare the limitations of mainstream Eurocentric theory and approaches to understanding translation phenomena. Multilingualism has always been the experience of those societies at the receiving end of imperial dispensation, as well as most multi-ethnic communities without imperial ambitions. Most societies have always lived with several languages, whether for trade or commerce, political or intercultural relations. It is often said that empire do not translate, which exposes the monolingual foundation of Eurocentric translation theory that assumes a transfer between stable monolithic entities. Multilinguality, which is consonant with the postcoloniality of discourse emanating from linguistic minorities, is a way of life and a staple in such communities in the global South and the global North. This reality of the multiplicity of cultures and multilingual existence for the vast majority of humanity has been at once daunting and promising for the evolution of translation studies. The term multilinguality speaks to the unique ability of subaltern communities to invent, develop, and use language based on their multilingual reality. The language of multilinguality is often steeped in the oral antecedents of such communities, which intersect with the adopted colonial language. Multilinguality is not just about knowledge or awareness of many languages, but rather the creation of a medium for poetic and aesthetic expression as a trace of cultural representation. Subaltern communities resort to multilinguality as a way of life for social cohesion and solidarity in coerced multicultural societies, as a strategy of resistance to imperial imposition, as well as an emblem for cultural assertion within the global literary space. As much as art can often reflect reality, literary multilinguality often echoes real-life experiences in subaltern communities. Such multilinguality is often in display in other art forms such as popular music, for example, rap music, spoken word, and film. For example, the one I'm interested in is Nollywood films from Nigeria. When one listens to popular French rap, the lyrics are neither entirely in French, nor entirely in African or Antillean varieties of French, but rather in a blend of multilinguality that evokes the experiences of life in the banlieue and the influences of African American speak. The same can be said for Afrobeats in the Anglophone sphere, which have become global with a notable expression of multilinguality, which is neither entirely in English nor entirely in Pidgin English, but in a fusion of languages, including indigenous languages and other varieties spoken in urban centers and in the diaspora. Nowadays, Nollywood films, the Nigerian film industry, is a force to reckon with. Nollywood productions are highly emblematic of the practice of multilinguality, which in some ways has become an asset and enhances the appeal of such films across Africa and globally. The task of the translator in dubbing or subtitling such films for global consumption is monumental and must be accounted for in translation theory. These are but a few examples of the challenges raised for translation by the language practices of linguistic minorities in the post-colony as well as in the metropole or diaspora. Unlike post-colonial writers of the immediate post-independence era, whose writing was construed mainly as a counter to colonization, writers of contemporary literature about life in the post-colony adopt a more centripetal or inward outlook focusing mainly on art, literature, and culture within the nationscapes, rather than engaging in knee-jerk reactions to the whims of the colonial metropole. Rampant urbanization due to rural exodus as a consequence of modernization has brought disparate ethnicities in urban centers, creating a kind of ethnoscape where various languages and cultures coexist. In spite of the official imposition of colonial languages, urban communities tend to relegate such European languages to officialdom and are at ease with locally derived languages, resulting from the practices of multilinguality and heterolinguality. This is often manifested in a kind of creolization of language that is aimed at resolving linguistic differences and finding common ground in an urban language that transcends ethno-linguistic specificities and helps to circumvent colonial language dominance and authority. The locally minted languages are often more suited to the linguistic and cultural expectations of the multi-ethnic urban communities, enabling communication in spite of linguistic differences and providing an outlet for artistic and literary expressions beyond the potential of the imposed European language. In African and Caribbean societies, for instance, besides the local varieties of Standard English or Standard French, there are pidginized and creolized languages such as West African Pidgin English, le français populaire ou régional, as well as varieties such as le franglais, which is often used by the youth for in-group solidarity and to establish a sort of Pan-African global relations beyond the confines of national borders. Within the global reach of popular music, such as hip-hop and rap music, the practice of franglais is no longer limited to spaces where English and French coexist, but has become a mode of communication for the youth, especially in the Francophone sphere, where rap music has become a popular conduit for spreading the English language. These hybrid languages flourish in music, film, and literature, and convey a certain reality of contemporary post-colonial societies that complexify translation theory and practice. Writers and artists born after independence in the 1960s and beyond are more likely to engage their fictional characters in this kind of language as they are drawing on the experience of life in today's post-colony, rather than on the anti-colonialist leanings of their predecessors. Francophone writers such as Calix Beyala and Alain Mabankou, and Anglophone writers such as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and the young and upcoming Mbue in the United States, depicting the experience of contemporary Africa and African diaspora in their novels. The ideal of the post-colony is not only a geopolitical construct, but fundamentally a state of being. The fact of being a post-colonial subject in the global scheme of things, whether living in the formerly colonized spaces or abroad in the diaspora. The agency of the post-colonial subject transcends colonial boundaries and remains the essence of formerly colonized peoples, regardless of historical and political landscapes. In other words, the linguistic minority status of migrant communities in the metropole is heavily indebted to their post-colonial subjectivity. It is indeed noticeable how the multilinguality of the post-colonial, I would say, extends to the communities of the diaspora through migration and mutates into other varieties through the specific experiences of migrant communities in the colonial metropole. Obviously, the descendants of immigrants or immigrant populations in the metropole, born in the metropole, would normally develop linguistic habits or traditions that are peculiar to their experience as natural-born citizens in the metropole. For instance, the specific language of the Parisian banlieues or the urban speak of Black British youth in London is entirely homegrown although it might intersect with linguistic trends in the urban settings in the post-colony. In the current context of globalization, there is rampant movement and exchanges between subjects in the post-colony and the diaspora, some of whom might still entertain relations with the ancestral home. Language has developed along this continuum between the post-colony and the diaspora that has been nourished by urban experiences in both landscapes. The artistic, cultural, and literary productions of the post-colony and the diaspora often share some common roots with overlapping performances that can be traced back to either landscape. There is frequent collaboration among artists living in the post-colony and the diaspora who may have a shared sense of purpose, thus establishing a cultural and linguistic continuum that may serve as a platform for giving voice to the marginalized. The language of these marginalized groups gains global significance as other marginalized groups with other linguistic antecedents strive to emulate and appropriate the fundaments of the language for their own struggles against domination and oppression. For instance, in the current times, hip-hop or rap music has become a global phenomenon, taking on different linguistic incarnations, yet with a constant in terms of its linguistic hybridity and multilinguality. Literary productions also draw on these trends, making for complex writing techniques that call for complex translation strategies. There is therefore a continuum between the specific uses of French in the African post-colony and in the African populations and migrant communities in France. Calix Beyala explores this continuum in her novel Les Honneurs Perdus, which begins in the bidonvilles of Douala in Cameroon and ends up in the banlieues of Paris. In either context, the French language is minoritized and claimed by migrant communities with the aim of asserting identity and calling attention to their respective plight. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie traces a similar trajectory between an urban reality in Lagos, Nigeria, and African communities in America in her novel Americana, though in this case, the narrative evolves in the opposite direction from America back to Nigeria. Imbolo Mbue's novel, Behold the Dreamers, is about a Cameroonian immigrant couple living in Harlem, New York, and their struggles to achieve the American dream, which turns out to be quite elusive for them, and they end up returning to their home country of Cameroon. There is a similar trajectory here between the post-colony and the diaspora. But what seems intriguing is the multilinguality and heterolinguality, which mixes Cameroonian English, African French, Pidgin English, and the author's native Bakweri language. There is a deliberate confrontation of American versus Cameroonian English, a play on the duality of Anglophone and Francophonie, and the assertion of Pidgin English as a lingua franca in West Africa, enabling communication beyond and above ethnic or national boundaries. Pidgin English is the ideal language used by the illegal alien from Cameroon and his fake immigration lawyer, originally from Nigeria, to circumvent American immigration officials. The task for the translator is to account for or replicate the multilinguality and heterolinguality of expression as a writing strategy deployed for a variety of reasons by authors from linguistic minorities. It must be grasped as a holistic approach to literary creativity rather than a mere scattering of languages in the narrative as signposts of identity. There is a naturalness inherent in the kind of code switching and code mixing practiced by the characters and the narrator. Translation discourse must seek to account for the specificities of these minoritized language varieties as a true measure of the representation of otherness and diversity in the ever-evolving history of a global language. Here are a few examples drawn from Imbolo Mbue's 2016 Behold the Dreamers, which I just want to give to you so that you have a sense of the kinds of texts that I refer to when I talk about multilinguality rather than multilingualism, or heterolinguality rather than heterolingualism. Because I understand multilinguality to be something that is beyond the simple or the mere fact of putting languages together, or having a number of languages, different languages within the text. Is this specific use of diversity within the language of authority, within English or within French. Take the first extract, which is quite revealing in terms of how Mbue uses this particular aspect of multilinguality to assert the specificity or the identity of her writing, being the writing of a Cameroonian immigrant in the United States. So here we go. He would have the house furnished with basic necessities and a housemaid hired by the time the family arrived. Look you, Fatu said when Nenny told her about the house and the maid. You're gonna leave small one room and go stay for mansion. Why Usman not do this for me too? So ask Usman to take you back home then. Usman no want to go back home. She paused and looked at the empty luggage lying on the living room floor. If only me, I go back. I go back to my village, build house near my mother and my father. I live quiet life, die quiet die. If only me, I go home. Très bientôt. Here in a very small excerpt that we have, you can see how Ebola is basically presenting the discourse of a Francophone immigrant in New York who is attempting to speak English. It's not speaking Pidgin at all, but it's speaking English. So Fatou would say something like, she's of Malian origin, look you, which is simply a variety of what you would say, such as look at you. And then she would then have this incredible hybrid mix of language, which is picking up a bit of Americanisms, and say something like, you're gonna leave one room to go stay for mansion. Why Osman not do this for me? So you can see in the language itself, which is quite clear, understandable, that what is happening here is a kind of representation of the discourse that one can associate with a Francophone living in New York who may not have a good command of English, but who is not speaking Pidgin English either, because Pidgin English is not available usually to some Francophones in places like Mali. Okay, all right. Then what happens at the end of it is she says, Usman no want to go back home, meaning Usman doesn't want to go back home. If only me, I go back, meaning if it was up to me, if it was my decision alone, I would go back home. I'll go to my village, build a house near my mother and my father. I would live a quiet life, die quiet, which is interesting, a die quiet die, okay? And concludes by saying, I go home très bientôt. Basically, of course, revealing her French background in French, but the idea of saying I go home très bientôt is quite revealing of the multiplicity of her linguistic identity in this context. The next one, which is quite interesting in the sense of how people use Pidgin English in terms of almost a standard given language, langue figée, as you would say, meaning here it's almost like a proverb that the author is using, a proverb that is drawn from, or a saying or figurative language that is drawn from Pidgin English. One can never trust any government. I don't trust the American government, and I definitely don't trust the Cameroon government. No, but it's our government and it's our country. We love it, we hate it. It's still our country. How man go do? How man go do? That is what really holds our attention, okay? How man go do? It's our country, Winston agreed. We can never disown it. How man go do, for those who understand Pidgin English or who are familiar with Pidgin English, it's a very interesting statement of resignation. What can we do It's basically that. What can we do? There's nothing we can do about it. You got to love your country. You know, good or bad, you're going to love your country. How am I going to do? Now, this is things that are integrated in Imbolo Mbue's very recent novel that has gained a lot of international attention, and she was very much acclaimed within the New York literary scene for this particular novel. The next one, it's mostly about how difficult, and I think some of the papers presented in this conference discuss these kinds of issues, about how difficult it is often to translate or represent culinary or gastronomic items from minority cultures or distant cultures, if you want to call them that. So you have words and names of foods and dishes and all the like that would require a bit of understanding to be able to represent them. Some of you may be familiar with some of this. Egusi stew, atieke, moi moi, soya, jollof rice, and curry chicken and all that. Like, some of these things have become quite global, actually. That's the interesting aspect of this. They've become quite global. And you would go to some African restaurant in New York or London, and you would be familiar, you would find that even the locals are quite familiar with these dishes. Anyways, the last one, or the next one I would say, is quite interesting because it actually reveals oh my God, this is the one I was discussing. Sorry, I did not move that. This is the one about the, sorry about that. This is the one about dishes and all the like that I was talking about. So I hope you will remember exactly what I was saying. Now, the last one. Listen to me, Boubacar said, somewhat impatiently. As far as immigration is concerned, there are many things that are illegal and many things that are gray. And by gray, I mean the things that are illegal, but which the government doesn't want to spend time worrying about. You understand me, Abi? My advice to someone like you is to always stay close to the gray area and keep yourself and your family safe. Stay away from any place where you can run into police. That's the advice I give to you and to all young Black men in this country. The police is for the protection of white people, my brother. Maybe Black women and Black children sometimes, but not Black men. Never Black men. Black men and police are palm oil and water. You understand me, eh? Again, you can very well understand what the text is discussing. But from a linguistic standpoint, I'm particularly interested in how the author uses the concept of gray and the popular expression abi, which is often used in Nigerian English or Pidgin English to confer that your person is listening to you. And then the last part there, which I find particularly interesting, kind of a proverb in Pidgin English, which has been transposed here. Black men and police are palm oil and water. You can understand what this is all about. But in an African context, to talk about palm oil and water is about the same thing as saying in English, oil and water do not mix. You cannot mix them. It is quite interesting that this particular passage was written, and it's kind of resonant of the context of it is kind of resonant of what is happening in the United States right now, the last year or so, about the Black Lives Matter and the fear of police, about police shooting of young Black men. But this is a very interesting scene. It's an interesting scene where Boubacar is a lawyer, fake lawyer, Nigerian lawyer, who is basically trying to help out if you want, the Cameroonian immigrant to get their status in the United States. Anyways, this to me, I decided to use as the kinds of text that I would represent in this whole discussion of linguistic multilingualism. But in my case, I'm looking at it from a point of view of multilinguality, which again is the fact of not necessarily having a number of different languages put together, but the fact of using language in a different way that reflects the interest and the identity of linguistic minorities. To continue on this, I would say this. I would go to the conclusion, which is, I hope I'm doing okay with time. It's kind of interesting because being in this format is kind of hard to know exactly how I'm doing with time. But I will talk about the conclusion, which I would relate to all this and relate it to current events that are happening today. I would like to conclude by tying the notion of linguistic minorities to the various communities engaged in activism worldwide, fighting for the rights of marginalized peoples or groups, and drawing attention to injustices and inequities whose resolution is long overdue. Beyond the preoccupation with neocolonialism in the postcolonial and the diaspora, there is a growing sense of urgency globally to address issues related to indigenous rights, intersectionality, class, gender, sexual orientation, LGBTQ, and racism. Postmodern ideas such as decoloniality, particularly having to do with indigenous rights, and critical race theory have set the ball rolling on struggles such as those of the Black Lives Matter, against white supremacy, anti-Black racism, and cultural appropriation. This has led to controversial practices such as cancel culture and wokeness, which have ruffled feathers in some quarters and resulted in a serious racial and cultural divide in America, but also in other spaces where inequality and power asymmetry have characterized relations throughout history. We can see that the perception and use of language plays an important role in this societal divide, as the use of racist epithets or names depicting minority icons such as Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, and Native American heroes as emblems for capitalist gains have come under attack. These epithets or names are to be effaced or rewritten in order to be mindful of the concerns of ethnic or linguistic minorities. There is a kind of retranslation or reinscription at work here, driven by the activism of minoritized communities, who, in spite of their minority status, do represent an important force in the globalized culture of consumerism, a fact that is not lost on the dominant economic class. Intersectionality is a theoretical paradigm that focuses on marginalized and minoritized groups and challenges the Anglo-normativity or linguistic indifference inherent in dominant systems or societies. Although it still operates mainly within the American academia, intersectionality has the potential to enlighten us on issues related to cultural and linguistic minorities, such as the rights of women, the working class, people with disabilities, LGBT communities, and BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Intersectionality encourages transcultural and transnational understandings across various contemporary social and ideological spaces. While intersectionality challenges Anglo-normativity, it can also point us as language specialists towards challenging Franco-normativity, which is the desire to overcome the dominance of hexagonal French in order to account for other linguistic minorities within the Francophone sphere. It calls attention to contemporary literary, cinematic, and other forms of cultural production inspired by the complex intersections of identities within the linguiscape. Intersectionality is relevant in post-colonial, transnational, and translingual contexts for the study of interactions between dominant and minoritized communities. It can help to elucidate past historical and contemporary moments and the evolution of practices that have sustained social inequities and the transgression of minority language rights. Intersectionality also engages the issues of untranslatability or translatability and the commensurability of cultures. It can be applied to minority linguistic practices, multilingualism, indigeneity, queerness, and linguaphobia, the rejection of minority language practices by the elite or dominant society on the one hand, and the deliberate and political transgression of standard language by the minoritized. This is where translation studies overlaps with the body of trans studies now common in Anglo-American universities, and expands the field's purview beyond the mainstream Eurocentric or Euronormative foundation. Ultimately, intersectionality delves into the complex relations in today's multicultural society in an effort to decolonize Anglophone and Francophone spaces. In many ways, the translation of linguistic minorities could be conceived as a decolonizing project aimed at countering the effects of power asymmetry in the context of globalization. I have noticed that the papers presented at the conference deal variously with the overriding concern for the treatment of linguistic minorities in translation and how this has shaped translation discourse. It is indeed timely and apropos to explore this issue at a moment in history that continues to witness the reverberations or commotion caused by the demands of marginalized or minoritized communities. Thank you so much for listening to this. It's not been easy being in this format, but I hope I have managed to put across what I consider to be the current perspective that one needs to adopt in dealing with multilingualism in relation to minoritized cultures and translation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for this fascinating and very rich talk. I think you addressed so many issues, and it was the perfect opening conference. I think it is a perfect backdrop for the rest of the conference in the 3 days to come. And I think you started by questioning this concept of minority language, and I think it is, of course, very important. And also at the center of your talk was the concept of what you call multilinguality. Mm-hmm. And you showed perfectly how it changes the way we envisage, or we have to envisage translation theory and practice. Mm-hmm. And I think the examples you showed at the end were particularly illuminating as well. There is one question in the chat, so I'll start with it. We haven't got much time left for discussion. So the first question is by Camille Legal. Question for Paul. What do you think of the challenge for translators into French to retain the multilinguality without including forms that would sound read wrong, uneducated to French readers? That's the first question.
Okay.
Was that clear? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I mean, this is what practicing translators usually raise as an issue with respect to this kind of translation. I was at a conference in Cologne, Germany, not long ago, and it was about, knowing how to deal with this and still be relevant to the mainstream monolingual reader, of French, who may not be familiar with these kinds of varieties. My take on this is that I don't believe in the idea of having to go and search within similar types of practices, say in French Caribbean French or things like that. I mean, I feel like those kinds of ready-made set formats where you would go look for equivalents in Caribbean French or African French, and they sometimes fall flat. Because they may not be doing justice to the practitioner, or rather doing justice to the author who was very creative in doing what they're doing. So my advice would be to look at the French public, the French audience, see their degree of understanding of this kinds of work, and try to be as creative as the source, as the author was in English. If it's translating from English into French, try to be as creative in English, in French, in the French rendition of this language, but being creative enough with a certain degree of transparency. Transparency in the sense of fluency, if you want, meaning that the reader who is a monolingual French speaker should still be in a position to comprehend what is going on. If you look at the examples I gave you by Imbolo and Mbue, the way those, this is why what I mean by multilinguality, the way the Africanness or the non-Americanness of the text come across, the way they've been expressed, they're expressed such that an Anglo-American, a monolingual Anglo-American, can very well understand what is going on. They may not be familiar with that language, but they would understand it clearly. What does that mean? It means that you use some kind of creative ability to be able to write it up such that emulate the author's practice, the way the author managed to put this across. That's what I would say. I'm not really for wholesale importations from Creoles or Pidgins and contact languages left and right. No, you need to be a bit as creative as the source author. And in many cases, what I would advise my colleagues who contact me is that you should have a little chat with the writer if that's possible, and see what they think about this, because that kind of creative is really important. That's how I see it. It's very much dependent upon the ability of the translator to be as creative in their target language. Keeping in mind the clarity or the understanding of the monolingual French reader in this case.
I have another question from YouTube, from James McDonald. If I've understood correctly, you have stated that people use franglais for in-group cohesion purposes. Mm-hmm. On which basis may one make such a statement?
Mm-hmm. Interesting question. Franglais became, especially in the African context, something that was basically created by the youth, especially university students, mostly university students, started creating this variety, which was what sociolinguists would call what they call in-group solidarity. There's a term for it for those who know sociolinguistics. It's called Phatic communion, PHATIC, Phatic communion, meaning people develop a language for their own in-group communication. Usually it's done to, basically counter authority, stay away from authority, or deprive authority from being able to understand what you're saying. It's a way of, if you want, resisting authority. They did that. So, in what context would people use franglais? Franglais developed principally or mainly in bilingual, official bilingual contexts, such as in Cameroon, where they have French and English as bilingual, official bilingual languages. But it also develops in places such as in Canada, where I live, Montreal, where people are exposed to these two languages constantly. Now, when you have a situation where the youth grew up with two languages almost simultaneously, there is a tendency to develop such a hybrid language. But in this case, it was developed mainly, and it's become a force to reckon with from a sociolinguistic perspective, developed as what you would call a strategy for Phatic communion, meaning in-group solidarity, the youth versus the elite or the authorities, something like that. And then it becomes a way of speaking that becomes almost considered to be within youth culture, to be cool, if you want, something to be cool, to be fashionable and all that. And it exists in literature, in music, and in popular discourse.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Paul. I think we have to stop now because we're 15 minutes behind schedule already. And people can go on asking questions in the Frema pad anyway. Well, maybe Tiffany is taking over.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Bruno. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno.
Okay, and thanks very much, Paul, for opening the conference in such an interesting manner.